We'll be doing the Florida State Pouting Seminoles. So if you wonder why I'm calling them the Pouting Seminoles, you probably know why because of what happened late last season. So I think head coach Mike Norvell, who is entering his fifth season as the head coach at Florida State, has done a good job getting their program back to almost being a national title contender, but late last season showed that they still have a ways to go from doing that. And you can type in the comments until your fingers get worn out about how many players Florida State had out in that bowl game, but they lost by 60 points, and Georgia played their second string in the whole second half and still outscored Florida State 21-0. And Mike Norvell made a fool out of himself late last season with that, just fussing over missing out on the playoffs and not preparing his team for the bowl game. Of course, that they weren't even good enough to beat fully healthy with all of their players. So uh, now I'll talk some about the roster, and then I'll go through their schedule game by game and give you my predictions for each game. So starting on the offensive side at quarterback, they've made a huge downgrade, in my opinion, at the quarterback position from Jordan Travis, who was one of the best quarterbacks that Florida State has ever had, uh, to a transfer quarterback who was a five-star quarterback recruit and has been a starting quarterback in college for 3 years, but has never been any good in college. DJ Ukulele. His last name is kind of weird and hard to pronounce, so that's my nickname for him. And he was Clemson's starting quarterback for 2 seasons. That's where he started at in 2021 and 2022, and he was not any good there to where he got ran out of Clemson, and then he transferred over to Oregon State where he was their starting quarterback last season, and he had an okay year, but not a great year at all. And then Oregon State's coach left, so now he's transferred to Florida State for his final college season. And it's one thing if a five-star quarterback has played not very good in their first year as a starter in college. But when a quarterback has never been any good in 3 years as a starting quarterback, I have no reason to believe that he's going to be good this year at Florida State. But we'll see. I think that at wide receiver, it's going to be a problem for them too. They lose their two really good receivers from last season, both off to the NFL, Keon Coleman and Johnny Wilson, and he's going to have someone to throw the ball to, and right now no one proven at wide receiver. And then at running back, this is where they are good. Now they do lose Trey Benson, who was their starting running back these past 2 seasons, and was one of the best running backs in college football. I don't really think they have a replacement for him, but they do still have who was the number two running back last season, Lawrence Tofilia, who is good. He had on 69 carries last season, 463 yards, averaging 6.7 yards a carry and 4 touchdowns in 13 games. And he had in the ACC championship game last season on 10 carries, 118 yards and a rushing touchdown. He was probably why Florida State won that game because he was their offense in that game. They couldn't do anything other than what he did in that game. And they brought in a good running back from Alabama, Roydell Williams, who was Alabama's number two running back last season. And he had last season 560 yards on 111 carries and 5 touchdowns, averaging 5 yards a carry. So that's a nice two running backs for them to have. I don't know who will be the starting running back, but I expect those two running backs to share carries pretty evenly this season. And then the offensive line looks to be good. So they returned three starters. They returned tackles Darius Washington and Jeremiah Byers. But Washington played in 13 games and only allowed 11 total pressures and one sack. And Byers did allow a team high 27 pressures last season, but only allowed one sack. And then they returned center Maurice Smith, who played in 11 games and only allowed 16 total pressures and two sacks last season. Then they bring in a really good guard from Alabama, TJ Ferguson, who was a four-star recruit and played 116 snaps last season at Alabama and only allowed one pressure and no sacks in that. Uh, mm, so their offense, I think, is going to be a whole lot of running the football and not much throwing, with an average at best quarterback and no great or really even good wide receivers as of right now, but a couple of pretty good running backs and a strong offensive line. So Florida State's defense was really good last year, only averaging 18.6 points per game given up. And I think it's going to be pretty good again, but probably not quite as good as last year. So on the defensive line, they're probably taking a step back here. They lose two really good players on the defensive line. They lose Jared Verse, who was the best player on their team last season and maybe the best defensive lineman in the country last year, who went first round. Then they also lose Braden Fiskey, who was really good. But they still have Patrick Payton, who is also one of the best players at his position, and is probably the best player on Florida State's defense this year. He had last season 43 tackles and seven sacks and two forced fumbles and 10 pass breakups and 14 total pressures. I think he'll be a first round pick next year. And then they have Joshua Farmer, who had last season in 13 games, 32 tackles and five sacks and seven total pressures and two pass breakups and a forced fumble. And then they bring in a transfer from Oregon State, Sione Lononi, who had last season 46 tackles and one and a half sacks and nine total pressures and two forced fumbles and a fumble recovery. Then they bring in a five-star transfer from Georgia, Marvin Jones, who has only started one college game but played in 25 college games. And I saw looked really good in the spring and is expected to be a starter on their defensive line. And then at linebacker, they're not great here overall. They do have DJ Lundy coming back, who played in 13 games and started four games last season and had 54 tackles and two sacks and four pass breakups and four total pressures and an interception. And then they bring in a four-star linebacker from Alabama, Sean Murphy, who was the number six linebacker recruit of 2022, but hasn't played much in college. But I think he'll probably be a starting linebacker for Florida State this year. So the secondary looks to be maybe the best part of the defense. They return at cornerback Azaria Thomas, who only started one game but played in every game and had 29 tackles and 10 pass breakups and a forced fumble and fumble recovery. And then they return Fintrell Cypress, who had 40 tackles and eight pass breakups and a forced fumble last season. And then they return at safety at Shyheim Brown, who had last season 53 tackles and four pass breakups and two sacks and a fumble recovery and an interception last season. And then they return Conrad Hussey, who only started one game but had 22 tackles and two pass breakups and two forced fumbles and a fumble recovery and an interception last season. And then special teams looks to be really good for Florida State. They return two of the best specialists in the country. They return at kicker Ryan Fitzgerald, who made 19 of 21 field goal attempts last season and all 58 extra point attempts. and punter Alex Mastromola, who averaged 45.5 yards per punt last season. Now moving on to the predictions that they start the year on August 24th in Ireland against Georgia Tech. So I talked about this in the Georgia Tech game that I think Florida State's clearly a better team than Georgia Tech. But this is one of those games where I have a feeling that the worst team is going to win, and I'm going with Georgia Tech to pull the upset. So you can tell me in the comments that I'm dumb for making this pick, which is someone has pretty much already told me in the comments. But if you compare rosters with Clemson and Duke from last season, did Duke have a better looking roster than Clemson? No, but they won and they actually blew them out. Now, I don't think Georgia Tech's going to blow out Florida State. I think it'll be really close. So then they play Boston College. That this will be a Monday night game. So I think Boston College it might be good enough to be competitive in this game, but they're not going to be very good. And I think Florida State, even though they struggled with them last year, will end up winning this one by a couple of touchdowns. So then they play Memphis. So Memphis, I think, is better than the bad Power Four teams. They may be able to challenge Florida State a little bit. They may keep it close for a half, but I think Florida State will pull away and end up blowing them out. So then they play California. So California's defense was horrible last year, and it'll be horrible again this year. And they have no hope of slowing down Florida State's run game. And their offense is almost as bad, and they're not going to score much on Florida State's defense. This will be a blowout, I think. So then they play on the road at SMU. SMU, I think, will probably beat pretty much all, or maybe even all of the bad Power Four teams that they play this year, making their move to the Power Four in the ACC, and maybe even some of the average Power Four teams. But I still don't think they're going to be ready to beat the good teams in the Power Four like Florida State. And I think Florida State will be given a challenge in this game by SMU, but will end up winning by at least a touchdown. So then they play Clemson, a big conference game. They get them at home. So an interesting thing about this is it will be Clemson playing against their old quarterback that they ran off, DJ Ukulele, and the quarterback that they ran Ukulele off for Cade Klubnik. It turned out to be maybe even worse than the ukulele is. And Clemson's defense and Florida State's defense are pretty similar. I think Florida State's maybe a little bit better, and Florida State I think has the better offensive line than Clemson, and Florida State has more depth at running back than Clemson. Now Clemson's got better receivers, but a horrible quarterback is going to make that not really benefit them that much in this game. I think this one will be really close, but I think playing at home, Florida State has enough to get the win. Then they play on the road at Duke. Duke may have a better quarterback than Florida State this year, bringing in a transfer from Texas, Malik Murphy, who is a very talented quarterback. But Duke doesn't have very many playmakers at the wide receiver and running back positions that he would need to get Duke to a good season. And Duke doesn't have a very good offensive line. And Duke's defense still has a few really good players, but nothing like they had last year. I think Florida State will win this game by a couple of scores, at least 10 points. So then they play on the road at Miami in the big rivalry game. So I think Florida State's defense is more complete than Miami's. Florida State doesn't have a weakness like Miami probably does at the safety position, but I think Miami's front seven is even better than Florida State's. And can slow down their run game some. And even though Miami may have a safety weakness, Florida State, I don't think, can take advantage of that this year. And Miami's offense is probably going to be really good, and it's going to be very balanced. And I think even Florida State will have a hard time stopping it. And I think Miami's just the better team, and they win a really close one. So then they play North Carolina at home. So North Carolina's roster, if you take a look at it, is still pretty good, but I don't trust them to win this game. I think it'll be competitive, but Florida State will win by around 10 points. So then they play on the road at Notre Dame. So Notre Dame's transfer quarterback Riley Leonard, I think, is much better than the ukulele, and he's also a great runner. Uh, and Notre Dame's also going to have a great offensive line and a few good running backs, and they've got better pass catcher options than Florida State does, bringing in two really good receivers and a great tight end, Mitchell Evans. And Notre Dame's defense, I think, is even better than Florida State's. They've got three players on their defense that are likely going first round next year. So Notre Dame is just a better team, in my opinion, and they're playing at home, so no reason to pick Florida State. I think it'll be close, but I think Notre Dame will win this by around a touchdown. Then Charleston Southern, a nothing game, they'll win easily. Uh, and then they end the year in the rivalry game against Florida. So this game is at Florida State, and I still think Florida State is clearly a better team than Florida. Now, I think the rivalry will keep this one close. I think it'll be competitive, but Florida, I think, would have quit at this point. They won't have a coach. That coach that they have now, that's barely even a coach, will have been fired, I'm pretty sure. And Florida, I don't think will have anything left to play for at this point. I think they'll already be out of a bowl game. And I think that Florida State will win this one by around a touchdown. Uh, so my final prediction for Florida State is 9-3 overall and 6-2 in the conference. So that would very likely put them out of the ACC championship. But they have a good chance to get back in it. And if they get to 10-2, it'd be a 50-50 chance, I think, of going to the college football playoff in a horrible conference like the ACC. But they for sure not get in if my prediction comes true. But 10-2 is also a good possibility. So that will be it with this video. And please subscribe and thanks for watching. And I'll be back soon.